Thank you. First thing I would like to say, it's an absolute honour to be here to bring Northern Ireland's story to you from my frontline perspective and my frontline professional experience and from my personal experience, and indeed to bring you the story of Northern Ireland. First of all, Northern Ireland has suffered decades of war. However, post-war trauma is not officially acknowledged as a cause of rising levels of mental health problems and addictions. I grew up in Northern Ireland and later practiced as a community mental health nurse there. For this presentation, I will draw on my personal and professional experience to connect the trauma of war with the epidemic of mental illness, and I say that in inverted commas, in Northern Ireland today. I will explain how carefully constructed torture techniques that were devised in a Canadian university were used by the British military against many people in Northern Ireland. Because war-related trauma is not acknowledged in Northern Ireland, the pain of many survivors can only be communicated through symptoms of mental illness. I will describe the experiences of two former patients to show the link between those experiences and subsequent symptoms. It is well established that social and economic deprivations have a negative impact on mental health. Many of those who were tortured and exposed to violence during the war were made more vulnerable to psychological breakdown because of pre-existing hardship. You may not know much about Northern Ireland, so permit me to provide a brief history. Northern Ireland became an entity in 1921, following the War of Irish Independence from Britain. The 32 counties of Ireland were partitioned into two jurisdictions. 6 counties officially known as Northern Ireland would be governed by Britain, and the remaining 26 counties officially known as the Republic of Ireland would be independent from British rule. The division of Ireland created an internal political division within Northern Ireland. Unionists who wish to remain part of the United Kingdom are mostly Protestant. Republicans and nationalists, who are mostly Catholics, advocate for Irish unification. For 50 years after the partition of Ireland, the Northern Ireland Parliament was dominated by Protestant Unionists. Catholics were discriminated against in employment and housing. That is not my opinion, that is fact. In the late 1960s, a Northern Ireland civil rights movement, modelled on the black civil rights movement in the US, marched and campaigned for social change. Violence erupted, and in 1972, the Northern Ireland Parliament was suspended. Direct rule from London was imposed, and the British military was dispatched to put down the rebellion. The British Army was supported by local forces loyal to Britain. Armed conflict ensued until the ceasefires of 1994 and 1996. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement declared the conflict officially over, although by no means were all the problems solved. The authorities officially denied that there was a war in Northern Ireland. They call it the Troubles or the conflict. During that 30-year period, over 3,700 people were killed, and as many as 50,000 people were physically injured, from a population that currently stands at less than 2 million. Hundreds were imprisoned and tortured, even though it is officially denied that torture was applied in interrogation centres and prisons in Belfast. There is significant evidence that it was systematic and policy-driven. The background of torture has had a devastating impact on intergenerational mental health. Last month, the BBC released a chilling documentary that exposed how undercover British intelligence agents engaged in a dirty war to defeat the Irish Republican Army. Many of their torture techniques were adapted from research done by a Canadian psychologist, Dr. John Zubak. Now, I came to learn about Dr. John Zubak from the book Psychiatry Interrogated. So in her paper, an exploration of the academic development of torture and its links to military and psychiatry, Efrat Gold, and she's here today, thank you Efrat, reveals how Dr. John Zubak, a prominent psychologist at the University of Manitoba, became a leading world expert in the development of psychological torture techniques. In 1968, the National Research Council of Canada funded Zubak to build the largest sensory deprivation laboratory in Canada and one of the largest in the world. Just 4 years later, the results of Zubak's research would be used in Northern Ireland. Zubak paid students to volunteer for his experiments. He placed some in a dark tent that prevented vision and fitted them with noise-cancelling headphones and gloves that would inhibit their ability to interact with their body and the environment. Others were subjected to white noise, exposure to constant bright light, stress positions, and sleep deprivation. Many students reported extreme confusion, disorientation, vivid hallucinations, loss of contact with reality, and time distortions. Between 1971 and 1975, more than 1,000 people were interned in Northern Ireland without trial. They were held in an internment camp known as Long Kesh, where on several occasions they were beaten, tortured, and sprayed with tear gas. Over the following years, hundreds more young men, women, and even children were detained and tortured. Recently, a Channel 4 documentary profiled one of those young boys, as young as 17, recognised by the UN as a child. He was detained and subjected to torture techniques. It was recently revealed that 14 men who were hooded and taken to a secret location to be tortured in 1971 will take a case to the European Court of Human Rights to seek clarification that they were tortured, known today as the hooded men. They were subjected to the 5 sensory techniques developed by Zubak. These techniques are prolonged wall standing, hooting, subjection to noise, deprivation of sleep, and deprivation of food and drink. These techniques were intended to break people down psychologically, and they were highly successful at accomplishing that. Now, many of my patients experience most, if not all, of these tortures, as well as other brutalities which damage them psychologically and traumatized entire communities. And though bound by confidentiality, Zubak's students began to talk about his experiments in 1972. They openly protested when they discovered the link between Zubak's research and torture techniques being employed by the British military in Belfast. This information was never revealed to the people of Northern Ireland. In 1976, the European Commission found the British government guilty of torture, inhumane and degrading treatment. The British government appealed this ruling, and after intense lobbying, the European Commission backed down and removed the word torture from its findings. As a result, the US, Israel, Turkey, and other countries have been able to use the same torture techniques without being accused of using torture. In 1976, the British government tried to cover up the reality of the war by abolishing the status of political prisoner. Those convicted of a political offence were denied political status and held as criminals instead. The name of the notorious Longcash internment camp was changed to HMP, that's Her Majesty's Prison, the Maze, which was built as a top security prison designed in the shape of a H and known as the H blocks. This prison occasionally used solitary confinement, a form of sensory deprivation. Britain's strategy of isolating large numbers of prisoners in the 1970s was taken up by other countries, including the US. As the war continued, the prison population increased dramatically, and so did brutality and violence inside the prison and on the streets. In 1980 and 1981, Republican prisoners embarked on a hunger strike to demand political status because they refused to be criminalised. The result was the death of 10 young men in their 20s, all of whom had endured torture. One of them was 27-year-old Bobby Sands, who had been elected to the British Parliament as an anti-H block candidate. The hunger strikers did succeed in drawing attention to prison conditions, and images of torture, like the 2003 images from the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, provoked mass protests across Ireland and internationally. Thousands marched on the streets. Shootings, bombings and violence were a daily reality for the people of Northern Ireland. Our lives were defined by those years. While imprisonment was a predominantly male experience, it impacted on hundreds of families and communities. The burden of raising children in poverty, coupled with the war environment, was borne predominantly by the women. Whole communities were traumatised. I worked in an area that was heavily affected by the war. Not only did I bear witness to the testimonies of torture victims, I bore witness, and still do, to the many with drug and alcohol addictions, youngsters caught in the judicial system, mothers struggling to raise their children in communities plagued by addiction to drugs, both prescribed and non-prescribed. I want to emphasise that the vast majority of those who suffered directly from the war lived in impoverished communities. Northern Ireland has some of the most socially deprived areas in Europe. When the war began in the early 1970s, many were living in poverty. Many large Catholic families lived in small houses not fit for habitation, even before the First World War. They had no electricity, no running water, no bathrooms or indoor toilets. Catholics suffered discrimination in employment and many were forced to emigrate to find work. These conditions contribute to mental health difficulties. Many were hopeful when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998. Almost 3 decades later, the situation for many has worsened. Today, Northern Ireland is one of the most researched areas in the world in terms of high rates of suicide, depression, addiction, and psychiatric drug use. Several studies show that whole communities from working class and socially deprived areas are being excessively diagnosed with mental illness and prescribed excessive amounts of drugs. According to findings from an international study, the link between deprivation and antidepressant prescription rates is stronger than in England and Wales. Northern Ireland is a leading prescriber of psychiatric drugs. Over the past 5 years, 70 million was spent on drugs to treat depression in Northern Ireland, almost twice as much as was spent in England. The number of children and teenagers prescribed psychiatric drugs has increased year on year since 2012. Diazepam has been dispensed more than 100,000 times in just 5 months. Frequently prescribed drugs include Prozac, Celexa, Advil, benzodiazepines, and neuroleptics. Imagine how much could be achieved if the £70 million spent on psychiatric drugs over the past 5 years had been invested in helping these communities. Instead, social support programs run by the people who use them would do a lot to improve people's mental health. No one disputes that there is a mental health crisis in Northern Ireland. Last year, a GP in the area where I worked expressed his concern about an unprecedented rise in heroin dependency and the deaths of some addicts under the age of 30. These victims were children when the ceasefires happened, perhaps not yet born. Elected politicians from both Unionists and Republican communities have also voiced their concern. One Unionist politician complained of a total absence of strategic thinking when it comes to defeating depression, and that exploration and expansion of alternative therapies to prescription drugs, including specialist counselling services, should be a priority. The Minister of Health, herself a nationalist, proclaimed that mental health is a key priority. Sounds very promising. However, the authorities will find no solution until they address the root of the problem, the consequences of the war, and the ongoing economic and social deprivation. Zubeck's research demonstrated a clear link between torture and what we call psychosis. However, the denial of torture enables post-traumatic suffering to be mislabeled as medical pathology. I have encountered this form of victim blaming in my practice as a nurse and in the communities of Northern Ireland where I grew up. To be silent, to not speak of the war and its consequences, reinforces this medical victimisation. Because the link between social conditions and mental health problems remains hidden, many people internalise the cause of their suffering. They mistakenly believe that they are to blame for their situation, and they see their DSM diagnosis as a sign of personal defect. Siobhan O'Neill, a professor of mental health in Northern Ireland, was involved in a study of transgenerational trauma. In a recent interview, she emphasised the importance of drawing a link between the Troubles and suicide rates. And she said a whole generation was traumatised and saw some terrible things. Such research is welcome, and it validates my own experience on the front lines of mental health care. However, many people are not being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Instead, they are diagnosed according to DSM guidelines. It is only the tip of the iceberg which hide the wounds of war. I will speak about two of my former patients, my patients' experiences. Their stories have already been in the public domain, first presented at an international World Health Organization sponsored conference. For almost 10 years, I worked as a nurse in London. After the Good Friday Agreement, I returned to Northern Ireland to work as a community mental health nurse. In my Belfast practice, I bore witness to the stories of people who had suffered horrific experiences during the war. I will briefly describe some of those experiences and the symptoms that resulted. I saw the difference. I had worked in London. I saw the difference and recognised the post-traumatic stress. First of all, I will speak about John. John is a 62-year-old man who lives alone. In 1971, on his way home from work, he was seized during a random police check. He was placed in an army jeep and used as a human shield to ensure safe passage through a Republican area. This is John's story. When he arrived at police barracks, he was interrogated. He reports being beaten, stripped naked, a hood placed over his head, and a snooker cue inserted in his rectum. He was held underwater for short periods of time, which resulted in repeated drowning sensations. He was subjected to sleep deprivation. His skin was burnt with cigarette butts, and he was set upon by dogs. He was then incarcerated in a prison ship, and then he spent 4 years in Longkesh, where he reports that he was sprayed with tear gas. In 1978, 2 years after his release, he sought mental health services for what he described as a mental breakdown. His symptoms include a history of alcohol dependence, recurrent flashbacks, paranoia, auditory and visual hallucinations, depressed mood, poor memory, a phobia of dogs, and a history of suicide attempts by overdose. He was labelled with schizoid affective disorder and prescribed a cocktail of 6 psychotropic drugs: Effexor, Haldol, risperidone, lithium, Valium, and Zopiclone, all neuroleptics and benzodiazepines. This treatment was geared to changing John's brain. Few inquired about the connection between his lived experience and his symptoms, even though Zubek's research documents show how this connection is obvious. He may have difficulty trusting healthcare professionals and believe them to be not interested, or wouldn't believe him, given the official stance authorities take in relation to that period. John only reveals his story to people he can trust. How could he trust healthcare professionals who he perceives are not interested in what he went through, or wouldn't believe it because the authorities still deny the existence of torture? John relies on the drugs to mask his terrible suffering. He also self-medicates with alcohol. As a result, he is unable to work or participate in social activities. I last saw John in 2008. He was still living in a haze of psychosis and prescribed drugs, a miserable state that had persisted since his release from prison 30 years earlier. The second patient I want to discuss is Tom, a 54-year-old man who lives alone. In the early 70s, his father was shot dead by paramilitaries, and Tom had to identify his body. Shortly afterwards, he was shot and wounded by British paratroopers himself. He also witnessed his friend being killed. His friend was shot in the jugular vein, so the room was full of blood, and Tom could smell burning flesh. He also endured frequent house raids and detentions, which included torture. During the conflict, Tom slept on the sofa. He was afraid of being shot in his bed, and he wanted to be prepared for another house raid. He remains hyper-vigilant and continues to sleep on the sofa in fear of being attacked. Tom's symptoms include a history of alcohol dependence, olfactory hallucinations where he smells burning flesh. He thinks he's being monitored and bugged by the British military, and he sees microphones coming out of the walls. He also sees blood on the floor. Tom was given a label of schizophrenia and was prescribed Largactil, Effexor, Seroquel, and Valium. He declined trauma therapy because he did not want to share his experiences with people he felt he could not trust. He had been criminalised by the system, and his story would not be believed by those who accept the official line that torture didn't happen. As I helped Tom explore his symptoms, he came to understand that his olfactory hallucination was the suppressed recollection of his own burning flesh. Seeing blood on the floor was related to witnessing his friend being shot in the neck. He came to understand that his hypervigilance was related to the need to be watchful because he never knew when his house would be raided or a gunman would enter his home. Tom's paranoia in relation to feeling bugged and microphones coming out of the wall was based in reality, because we know that many people were under surveillance and technology such as microphones and listening devices were used by the British military. I will finish off with solutions. I've talked about the problems, and we do have solutions. While I have encountered severe psychological trauma and addictions, I have also encountered amazing resilience. Northern Irish people are not mentally defective or biologically prone to mental breakdown. We need a social model that validates lived experiences instead of a medical model that pathologizes them. As frontline health workers, we have a duty to validate our patients' experiences. If we do not, we cannot help them. Worse, we become complicit in perpetuating the belief that suffering is a personal defect and not the result of lived experience. We need a different model of treatment because what currently is on offer is woefully inadequate. People who experience trauma need more than drugs to suppress their symptoms because society does not adequately address or acknowledge the psychological impact of war and social deprivation. Many people do not connect their experiences and their symptoms. I have often heard my patients say, "Oh, my mother was depressed, my father had schizophrenia or bipolar or bad nerves," which implies a genetic cause for their problem. Well, recovery must begin with the acknowledgement that many of the techniques devised by Zuback and taken to Belfast were designed to psychologically damage people and to terrorise whole communities. This is one of the major causes of our patients' suffering, and this must be acknowledged. If the European Court of Human Rights reverse their 1978 findings, the British may well apologise for torture and make the usual and tiresome claim that a few rogue elements were responsible, just like they did in Iraq. But we know that torture was common. Our patients' symptoms bear witness to that. Their symptoms communicate what they cannot say and what the authorities refuse to hear. Your patients may not have been through a war or experienced torture, but we know that many people suffer trauma in their families, in school and at work, not to mention a few. Psychological suffering is a normal and natural response to such trauma. If we health workers arm ourselves with an understanding of the social and historic roots of our patients' suffering, and we stand together with our patients, then we can be a powerful force for advancing their interests and our own. Thank you.